What if I told you that long before Instagram, long before TikTok, long before anyone talked about personal brands, millions of kids were already being trained to live two lives? This is Curly Curl, pop culture explained with a bit of spice. Follow for more cultural deep dives. That, in many ways, was the quiet cultural impact of Hannah Montana. On the surface, the premise looked like harmless Disney fantasy. An ordinary teenage girl who secretly lives as a global pop star. Blonde wig on, she's Hannah. Wig off, she's Miley. The songs were catchy, the tone playful, the stakes light. But beneath the glitter and laugh tracks sat a surprisingly modern idea. Identity could be managed. When the show premiered in 2006, social media was still taking shape. Teenagers were building MySpace pages, experimenting with early Facebook profiles, choosing photos and bios that represented a version of themselves they wanted others to see. For the first time, everyday people were actively curating their public image. Right at that cultural moment, Disney introduced a character whose entire life revolved around managing a public persona. Hannah wasn't just a fictional singer. She functioned almost exactly like a brand, a recognizable look, a stage identity, albums, tour, and merchandise. Meanwhile, Miley, the girl behind the wig, had to constantly protect the boundary between who she actually was and who the world believed her to be. That tension sat at the center of the story. Fame opened doors, but it also required careful control, deciding what the public could see and what had to remain private. Long before the vocabulary of influencers and digital branding became common, Hannah Montana was already dramatizing that balancing act, the challenge of maintaining a public persona while holding on to a private self. At the time, it played as light entertainment. But in retrospect, the premise reflected a cultural shift that was only just beginning to take shape. What made Hannah Montana culturally interesting wasn't simply the fantasy of fame. It was the suggestion that someone could live simultaneously as ordinary and extraordinary, as long as the boundary between the two identities was carefully managed. Before the mid-2000s, celebrity largely felt distant. Stars existed on television screens, red carpets, and magazine covers. Ordinary people didn't occupy that same space, but Hannah did. By day, she was a teenager dealing with school, friendships, and family life. By night, she stepped onto stages in sold-out arenas. The contrast was central to the show's appeal, but it also carried a subtle message. Fame wasn't necessarily about being fundamentally different from everyone else. It was about controlling which version of yourself the world was allowed to see. In hindsight, that logic feels strikingly familiar. Today, millions of people maintain a public identity online. Photos are filtered, captions edited, aesthetics curated. There is the version of the self presented to an audience, confident, polished, composed, and the quieter private self that exists outside the frame. The duality now feels normal. But culturally, it had to be learned. Hannah Montana did not invent the performance of identity. Public figures have always done that. What the show did was translate that dynamic for younger audiences, turning the management of image into something understandable, even aspirational. At the same time, the series never ignored the strain that came with it. Much of its narrative tension came from the effort required to maintain two realities at once: the near discoveries, the secrets, the constant negotiation between exposure and privacy. Seen from today's perspective, those storylines read almost as a preview of the pressures that now shape life online. The tools have changed, but the structure remains recognizable. A public persona designed for visibility, and a private self working quietly behind it. If the cultural layer of Hannah Montana was about identity, the economic layer was about control. Behind the bright wigs, punchlines, and catchy songs sat one of the most strategically engineered franchises Disney ever built. When the show premiered on Disney Channel in 2006, cable television still had a rare kind of power: monocultural attention. Millions of kids were watching the same channel at the same time. Disney understood something crucial about that moment. Attention was already centralized. The real opportunity was monetizing it vertically. Hannah Montana wasn't just a sitcom about a girl with a secret life. It was a synchronized launch platform. The series created weekly emotional investment, Viewers didn't just watch the character, they formed a relationship with her. That connection flowed directly into music. When songs appeared in episodes, they didn't feel like promotions. They felt like story moments. By the time albums released through Hollywood records, demand already existed. Fans already knew the songs and associated them with characters they cared about. The system scaled quickly. Concert tour sold out not because of radio dominance, but because audiences had already spent months inside the story. The Best of Both Worlds tour didn't feel like a separate commercial venture. For many fans, it felt like stepping inside the television world. At the center of this system was Miley Cyrus. But strategically, she functioned as more than a performer. She became the human core of a vertically integrated machine where Disney controlled the show, the music, the merchandise, and the promotion. That level of integration dramatically reduced risk. Traditional pop careers depend on unstable forces: radio play, press cycles, label negotiations, and shifting public attention. The Hannah Montana model bypassed much of that volatility. The show guaranteed exposure every week. Exposure created familiarity. Familiarity drove album sales. Albums fueled touring demand. Each piece reinforced the others. From a business perspective, it was diversification disguised as teen entertainment. The strategy became even more powerful because of its demographic focus. Teenage girls have historically been one of the most influential consumer groups in media. They drive repeat purchases, sustain touring markets, and build strong communities around shared fandom. Disney didn't just capture their attention, it built a lifestyle around it. Merchandise became an extension of identity. Wigs, clothing, backpacks, posters. The brand allowed fans to perform proximity to fame. If you couldn't be Hannah Montana, you could still feel connected to her world. Even the marketing lived inside the show itself. Songs appeared naturally within episodes, while performance scenes previewed real-world concerts. Instead of interrupting entertainment with advertising, Disney blurred the line between the two. Looking back, the model feels strikingly modern. Today's creators follow a similar structure. Content drives attention, and attention expands into merchandise, tour, and brand extensions. In that sense, Hannah Montana wasn't just a hit. It was a prototype. If the first two layers were identity and corporate strategy, the third layer was subtler but no less powerful: the commodification of teenage girlhood. Hannah Montana didn't just sell songs, concerts, or merchandise. It sold an idea of what it meant to be a teenage girl in the 2000s. On screen, Miley Stewart was normal. She struggled with school, friends, and crushes. She was relatable. Off-screen, or rather, when the wig went on, she was extraordinary, glamorous, and adored. Disney packaged this duality and presented it as achievable, desirable, and aspirational. Every accessory, outfit, and doll reinforced this. Kids weren't just consuming content, they were consuming a lifestyle blueprint. The backpacks, the fashion lines, the wigs, these weren't random tie-ins. They were tools to let fans perform proximity to fame. If you couldn't be Hannah, you could at least look like her, carry her brand, and inhabit that identity in micro ways every day. It's easy to forget, but this was a period before influencers normalized the idea that everyday products could become identity markers. Hannah Montana taught young audiences that consuming a brand wasn't passive, it was participatory. Wearing her jacket or singing along to her songs made you part of the story. You were enacting a version of celebrity in your own life. There's also a gendered layer to this. Teenage girls have historically been one of the most valuable consumer demographics in media, but rarely has their everyday experience been so directly linked to economic value. Hannah Montana made relatability itself a commodity. It transformed ordinary adolescence into something marketable, a series of choices, purchases, and behaviors that reinforced the character's influence while subtly instructing the audience on how to perform girlhood. And yet, the show presented all this as fun, harmless, even empowering. It was a fantasy, yes, but one that told girls, you can be ordinary and special at the same time. You can have the freedom to navigate the world as yourself, while also stepping into a curated, glamorous persona. The line between play and performance blurred. The act of consuming, the act of being a fan, became an education in branding, identity management, and aspirational living. the genius of Hannah Montana wasn't just in creating a star. It was in creating a system where fans could practice fame themselves, safely, through fashion, music, and imitation. In doing so, the show normalized the idea that identity, attention, and desirability could be curated, packaged, and consumed, lessons that would echo into the influencer economy a decade later. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most significant cultural shifts arrive disguised as glittery escapism, wrapped in the laughter of a teenage sitcom and tucked inside a blonde wig. For years, Hannah Montana was a perfect machine. The show, the music, the merchandise, the tour, everything moved in lockstep. But as often happens with manufactured perfection, reality started to push back. By the late 2000s, Miley Cyrus was no longer just playing a character. She was a teenager, a young woman trying to find her own voice beneath the layers of Disney polish. The public didn't see Miley Stewart. They only saw Hannah Montana. And the more invested the audience became in the character, the tighter the box around Miley's personal identity became. Her rebellion didn't erupt overnight. It unfolded in phases, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Outfits grew more provocative, performances more raw, lyrics more personal. Each bold choice was a statement. The brand could no longer contain her. Hannah Montana was an empire, but Miley was a person. And eventually, everyone notices when a person wants out. The cultural shockwaves were enormous. Fans felt betrayed. Parents were scandalized. Media outlets framed it as a fall from innocence. Beneath the tabloid frenzy, though, was a deeper truth: the tension between human growth and corporate expectation. The Hannah Montana brand had been engineered for perfection, but life isn't perfectly engineered. The tighter Disney tried to control her, the more inevitable the rebellion became. Economically, the stakes were high. Disney had built a multi-million-dollar ecosystem around a single performer. Every tour, album, and doll carried the character's brand. If the star behind it turned away, the machine could falter. And yet, this also revealed the fragility of manufactured fame. No matter how sophisticated the marketing, a real person will always find ways to assert autonomy. Miley's post-Disney transformation reframed the cultural conversation. Her rebellion became aspirational in a different way, both a warning and an example. It showed that brands are built on human effort, but humans are not brands. And it signaled a broader shift in pop culture. Audiences began caring not just about the performance, but about the performer's real-life choices and authenticity. In a sense, the collapse of Hannah Montana was inevitable. The system that had elevated her was the same system that made rebellion necessary. The more perfect the construct, the more it had to be broken for the person inside to survive. Yet the story doesn't end in tragedy. Miley's breakaway redefined her career. She expanded her audience, explored creativity on her own terms, and became an independent asset, no longer bound to Disney's ecosystem, but still carrying the lessons of brand management, audience engagement, and multi-channel strategy that Hannah Montana had taught her. Culturally, this phase added a new layer to the narrative. The glittery wig and upbeat theme songs now coexist with the story of a young woman negotiating fame, freedom, and identity. The lesson is clear. Fame built as a machine can create enormous momentum, but it cannot replace the human need for authenticity. The tension between brand and self, between performance and personhood, became the invisible engine behind the show's enduring fascination. It explains why, 20 years later, people still analyze, debate, and revisit Hannah Montana, not just as nostalgia, but as a case study in fame, identity, and the cost of growing up under a microscope. If the story of Hannah Montana teaches us anything, it's that timing is everything. The show arrived when media was centralized, audiences were captive, and a single channel could create shared cultural moments. Cable television in 2006 had a kind of monocultural power that's almost impossible to recreate today. Everyone watched the same shows. Everyone bought the same albums. Everyone lined up for the same concerts. That alignment made the ecosystem work. It made the empire possible. Hannah Montana wasn't just a show, it was a perfectly synchronized cultural machine. Every episode built emotional investment. Every song released inside the story felt natural, not like marketing. Tour and merchandise weren't add-ons, they were extensions of the narrative. Disney created a system where content, commerce, and fandom fed each other seamlessly. Culturally, it was a product of its time. Identity, audience, and corporate strategy converged in one moment. Economically, it was precise. Each revenue stream reinforced the others. Exposure led to music sales, which led to tour demand, which fed merchandise purchases. The character was both a story and a structure, designed deliberately to generate engagement and profit. But the magic depended on conditions that no longer exist. The concentrated audiences, the closed distribution pipelines, the ability to mold a teenager into both character and commodity, those were unique to that era. In today's fractured media landscape, replicating that kind of empire would be practically impossible. Fast forward to today, and attention is fragmented beyond recognition. Streaming, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, audiences are splintered into micro-fandoms. Niche content thrives. The era of monocultural hits and billion-dollar teenage pop empires is gone. Now, influence favors authenticity over perfection, constant content over tightly controlled storylines, and micro-communities over mass audiences. That's part of what makes Hannah Montana so fascinating in retrospect. It was a blueprint and a cautionary tale at once. Carefully curated identity, cultural resonance, and economic strategy collided to create something extraordinary, but also fragile. Behind the glitter, the tour, and the catchy songs, there was always a human at the center, negotiating control, freedom, and expectations. 20 years later, the show remains more than nostalgia. It's a lens for understanding fame, branding, and cultural evolution. It shows how identity and commerce can intertwine, for better or worse, and how timing, circumstance, and strategy can make something both iconic and unrepeatable. In a world where everyone now curates their own online persona, that lesson feels more relevant than ever.